Welcome to Awaken Florida. I'm your host Dave Ramaswamy. I have here with me Arundhathi Subramaniam, a well-known author and poet. Welcome, Arundhati. What awakens you?
What awakens me? I mean, I'm tempted to give you a facetious answer and say coffee. But, I think one has had several moments in one's life that have sometimes felt like derailment when they happened, but which proved actually to be an awakening of sorts. But there was also a time in my life when poetry failed me and language failed me, and that's when a spiritual journey began in earnest. And I realized then that there really can be no awakening without having a very conscious experience of what it is like to have your eyes firmly shut. And so it was a period of darkness, after which the coming awake, and I'm not saying the journey is by any means complete, but the coming awake felt like something very precious. The beginning of that journey felt deeply precious.
Let me specifically ask you about poetry now. How does writing poetry heal? And how does reading poetry awaken?
When I was younger, when I look back on my childhood and I think of my earliest fascination with poetry, it was because it felt like a kind of music. And I've always felt with music that you recognize it even before you understand it. So there was the sheer joy of sound and rhythm and velocity, and all of which I loved. It seemed like kinetic language, so it seemed like dance as well.
Sure.
If language was was choreographed, this is how it would be. That was the joy of it. Later, I discovered, like so many of us do, that poetry was a means of self-discovery, it was a means of self-expression. It was, for me, the shortest, the most direct, the most pleasurable, verbal route to myself that I knew. So it was very precious for that too. But even later in my life, when, as I said, language abandoned me for a phase in my life, I realized that what is absolutely vital to any poem is the pause. All those blank spaces on a page of poetry mean. They may not mean something, but they mean. They are the source from which all language emerges. And so I think when I began to approach those pauses with much greater respect, a newfound respect, and with a much deeper attentiveness, my poetry changed. It grew more perforated, more open to surprise, more bewildered at times. And I like to believe that when that happens, that kind of porosity happens in a poem, it becomes an invitation to others to inhabit spaces that are as much about sound as they are about silence. Both. Because the silence is really the source of a poem's octane.
The pauses.
The pauses. I think also that whenever one starts a spiritual practice of any kind that is focused on breath work, one's life changes, but also the way you write changes. I feel that my poetry is far more attuned to the very idiosyncratic nature of my breath than before.
How has the stories or the people you describe in this book, what have they taught you?
Well, since you also mentioned the Sadhguru book, it might be interesting to start there, or maybe even earlier when I wrote a book for Penguin India on the Buddha. I wrote that in 2005, and 5 years later I found myself writing the biography of Sadhguru. And the first thing that struck me was, of course, the distinction between a dead mystic and a live one.
Sure.
And I was delighted to have a live one, but it also meant, of course, that we had plenty to talk about and disagree about. But it was a fascinating journey, a roller coaster journey, and one from which I certainly did not emerge the way I started out. But what's been happening in the past 5 to 6 years, I would say, ever since I edited this particular anthology of bhakti poetry or devotional poetry called Eating God.
Sure.
I was increasingly drawn after that to the voices of women mystics. And I realized that while I had written on the Buddha, and I had a book on a contemporary mystic like Satguru, a wonderful, irreverent, larger than life, wonderful figure, I just felt I hadn't heard the voices of women enough. And it was time for me to tune into those voices, just really because I think all of us have a longing for a less lopsided spiritual legacy.
Absolutely.
We just need to hear the voices of women, those that have been tuned out for various reasons, or those women who've been turned into very decorative calendar art, and we've forgotten to see them afresh.
And India has a long tradition for our audience of women mystics, of women saints, and it's a well-known tradition for us.
It is. You're absolutely right.
It's probably not as prevalent in the West, but in India, definitely. Like the goddess tradition, the Shakti, the power of the feminine energy. So it's great that you connected with women mystics and who are living. And there are a lot among us, and their stories need to be told.
I think so. I felt it made a great difference to me to just listen in, to be the listener in these conversations. And I like to believe that there will be some reader out there